The Chelsea mansion stood as a silent testament to a history that refused to stay buried. Its Victorian facade was draped in the damp, clinging mist of a late autumn night, the stone walls absorbing the chill of a city that had long forgotten the events within. Inside, the air remained stagnant, heavy with the scent of floor wax and old, decaying paper. It was here that the Lamb family tragedy unfolded, a series of events that the authorities categorized as a definitive, closed-case catastrophe. But the truth was never quite so tidy. When Libby Jones received the envelope on her 25th birthday, she believed she was simply fulfilling a legal formality regarding an inheritance she barely understood. She did not know that the mansion was a trap constructed of decades-old secrets. The house did not just hold furniture and heirlooms. It held the remnants of a psychological dismantling that had systematically erased an entire lineage. As the floorboards groaned under the weight of the past, the evidence suggested that these deaths were not a desperate act of surrender, but a calculated, clinical execution. Welcome to Swasti Diaries, where we peel back the layers of the impossible. We look past the official records to the contradictions left behind in the dark. The investigation into the Lamb family did not begin with the police report, but with a single misplaced object that shifted the entire narrative of that night. Why did the house remain untouched for so long? And what did the silent architecture reveal about the true nature of the inheritance? Libby Jones walked into the Chelsea mansion not as a tourist, but as a ghost in her own inheritance. The air inside felt trapped, preserved in the stale atmosphere of a night that had never truly ended. She traced the dust-covered mahogany of the foyer, oblivious to the fact that the house was not merely a structure of brick and mortar, but a carefully calibrated mechanism of control. The official files called it a tragedy, a clean sweep of a lineage, yet the floorboards told a different story. They creaked under the weight of her presence, echoing the silence of the Lamb family who had been dismantled long before their final hours. She did not realize that every step she took was a performance for an unseen audience. Somewhere in the shadows, the caretaker, a figure whose very existence was erased from the family tree, watched the house settle. He knew the secrets hidden beneath the floorboards, the tapes that recorded the slow psychological erosion of the Lambs. Libby possessed the keys, but she did not yet understand that the lock had been changed years ago. She was not the beneficiary of a fortune. She was the final component required to validate a claim that had been rotting in the dark for decades. As she moved deeper into the parlor, she noticed the subtle misalignment of the wall paneling, a detail that did not match the blueprints she had studied. The investigation was no longer about a past mystery. It was an active pursuit of a survivor who was waiting for her to stumble into the final trap. The kitchen was not merely a room where meals were once prepared. It was a silent witness to a systematic erasure. Looking at the floor, the tiles remained polished, yet a deep rhythmic gouge ran from the heavy oak table toward the service entrance. This mark was not the result of a struggle, but a deliberate drag. I focused on the table, a sturdy farmhouse-style relic that sat exactly where the 1996 police report claimed the bodies were found. But the geometry of the room defied the official narrative. If 3 individuals had fallen here, the placement of the discarded kitchen knife, found beneath the radiator, nearly 6 feet from the nearest point of impact, made no logical sense. It was a clean stainless steel blade with a serrated edge, yet it showed no signs of the friction consistent with a frantic defense. The handle was pristine. It suggested a placement rather than a drop. I traced the perimeter of the room, my flashlight beam catching the edge of the pantry door. The wood was splintered around the lock, not outward, as if someone had been barred inside, but inward, as if the house itself had been sealed from the outside. Then I found the contradiction. The wall safe, tucked behind a heavy Victorian calendar, was wide open. The official record stated the Lamb family fortune was recovered in its entirety by the estate executors. Yet inside the safe, tucked into the velvet lining, sat a single modern-day receipt dated 3 months after the tragedy. The house had been empty for decades, yet someone had been paying the utility bills for a ghost. The receipt was an anomaly that demanded an explanation, but the true architecture of the lamb tragedy resided beneath my feet. I pressed my weight against a section of the floorboard near the heavy oak table, noticing a slight, unnatural give in the wood. Prying it loose revealed a hidden void, a dark cavity that had remained undisturbed for decades. Inside, the cache was modest yet devastating. A collection of worn cassette tapes and a stack of leather-bound journals. These were not the writings of a family in crisis, but the meticulous records of a slow, psychological dismantling. The entries detailed the arrival of a stranger, a man who positioned himself as a savior to the Lamb family during a period of profound financial instability. His language in the journals was chillingly precise. He spoke of the family as an asset to be liquidated, not as people to be protected. The cassette tapes contained recordings of late-night sessions, where the patriarch, Henry Lamb, was systematically isolated from his own kin. I listened to the faint, distorted hiss of the audio, hearing the stranger's voice guide the family toward an inevitable prescripted end. He had not just manipulated their finances. He had rewritten their reality until the only logical conclusion left to them was the one that led to their demise. As I examined the final journal entry, the date stood out. It was written mere hours before the house fell silent. The stranger had executed his plan with clinical precision, yet the journals hinted at a loose thread, a survivor who had remained a shadow in his grand design. I held the evidence, realizing the tragedy was never a mass suicide, but a calculated, cold-blooded acquisition. The journals did not just document a tragedy, they dismantled my entire understanding of who belonged in that house. I noticed a glaring contradiction in the handwriting. The entries dated after the supposed disappearance of the youngest child were written in the same steady, deliberate hand as the earlier ones, a hand that belonged to the woman I had always been told was my mother. But looking at the dates, she could not have been the woman who raised me. The timeline was impossible. She was a ghost in her own home, a stranger who had assumed the identity of the true matriarch years before the massacre began. This was not a family dynamic, it was a performance. The household hierarchy described in these pages was rigid, almost militant, with every member forced into a role that served the stranger's long-term goal. I realized then that the woman I called mother had been a prisoner, perhaps even a replacement, forced to play a part while the real family members were systematically erased from their own lives. If she was a pawn, then the man who guided them was never a savior. He was an architect of identity theft, using the house as a stage to finalize a claim that stretched back decades. I stared at the final page, where the ink was smudged by a single dark stain. The house held more than just dead memories. It held the blueprints of a stolen existence, and I was holding the key that proved the Lambs were never the owners of their own fate. The neighbors who lived on the periphery of the Lamb estate spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences, as if the very air around the mansion still carried the weight of Henry Lamb's influence. They described a household where the lines between family and congregation blurred into a singular, suffocating devotion. According to their accounts, Henry maintained a rigid, almost militant schedule that kept every inhabitant in a state of perpetual exhaustion. He was not a father. He was a choreographer of behavior, using the threat of isolation to ensure total compliance. When I cross-referenced their testimonies with the logs found beneath the floorboards, a chilling pattern emerged. The 3 deaths, the official tragedy that closed the case, were not the result of a sudden, chaotic breakdown. They were the culmination of a long-gestating strategy to eliminate anyone who could contest the inheritance. The survivors mentioned in the local archives were not merely missing, they were erased by design. My investigation shifted to the perimeter, specifically the service entrance that had been conveniently overlooked by the initial responding officers. There, wedged into the frame of a rusted iron gate, I found a fragment of heavy industrial-grade fabric that did not belong to any garment owned by the Lambs. It suggested that someone had entered or exited with deliberate, calculated stealth long before the sirens wailed. If the family was trapped in a cult-like cycle, someone else was watching from the shadows, waiting for the exact moment the hierarchy collapsed to claim what remained. The question remained, Was this intruder a ghost from the past or a player who had been hidden in plain sight all along? My search for the truth led me away from the London fog, across the channel, to a quiet, isolated farmhouse in the French countryside. There, I found the man who claimed to be the fourth lamb child. He lived in a state of self-imposed exile, surrounded by stacks of yellowing newspapers and fading photographs. As he recounted the final night in the Chelsea mansion, his voice remained steady, devoid of the tremor one would expect from a survivor of such violence. He spoke of the layout of the rooms, the specific rhythm of the locks, and the heavy silence that preceded the tragedy. Yet, his testimony shattered the official timeline. He insisted that the house was dead silent long before the police arrived, and he described a sequence of movements that directly contradicted the forensic reports gathered by the original investigators. The official file claimed the family was isolated, yet he spoke of a third party, a shadow that moved with purpose through the service corridors. I looked at the maps he provided, the sketches of a house I thought I knew, and realized the discrepancy was not an error. It was a deliberate construction. If he were telling the truth, the Lamb family massacre was not a tragedy born of internal collapse, but a calculated execution performed by someone who knew the architecture of their fear better than anyone else. The weight of his words created a new, sharper pressure. Every piece of evidence I had painstakingly collected now required a re-examination, for if the timeline was a lie, then the identity of the killer was still hidden in the dark, waiting for the final inheritance to be claimed. The photograph was not merely a faded relic. It was a structural failure in the Lamb family narrative. Tucked behind the backing of a portrait in the farmhouse, it depicted 4 children standing against the Chelsea mansion's limestone exterior, yet official records insisted there were only 3. This missing child was the key, the ghost who never left the ledger. I realized then that the tragedy was not a spontaneous combustion of a broken family, but a surgical removal of obstacles. The caretaker was not a stranger who arrived after the fact. He was the architect who had been dismantling the house from the inside for decades. Every floorboard I pried open, every cassette tape I recovered, and every journal entry I deciphered pointed to a singular, cold-blooded objective: the clean extraction of an inheritance that had been promised to a child who officially did not exist. The timeline of the mass tragedy was a fabrication, a smokescreen designed to hide the fact that someone had been living in the service corridors, watching, waiting for the final legal signature. My investigation had pivoted. I was no longer tracing a murder. I was tracking an identity thief who had successfully erased his own history to claim a fortune. The realization chilled me. The killer was not hiding in the shadows of the mansion. He was the shadow, and he had been using my own search to validate his claim to the property. If the 4th child survived, then the death certificates were the only thing standing between him and the Lamb estate. I had to know who he had become. The ledger entries from the early 90s did not lie. They whispered a truth far more chilling than any act of sudden violence. I pored over the bank statements and the offshore trust agreements, and the pattern emerged with terrifying clarity. Henry Lamb had not simply been a patriarch. He had been a systematic architect of financial erasure. The mansion was never just a home. It was a sophisticated vehicle for isolating assets, a shell designed to be discarded once the inheritance had been successfully siphoned into untraceable accounts. Every repair, every tax exemption, and every minor renovation listed in the ledgers was a calculated move to lower the property's valuation, while secretly transferring equity to a hidden beneficiary who existed only on paper. The tragedy was not a spontaneous breakdown of a family unit, but the final bloody liquidation of a long-term investment. The caretaker's role became painfully obvious. He was the liquidator, the one tasked with ensuring that no bloodline remained to contest the final legal claim. He had lived in the crawl spaces, documenting the slow decay of the family, waiting for the perfect moment to execute the final transfer of title. The cruelty was surgical. By the time the authorities arrived, the estate was already legally hollow, a ghost house waiting for the ghost to claim it. I held the final transfer deed in my hand, the ink still crisp, bearing a signature that predated the murders by a full week. The motive was never passion or madness. It was pure, unadulterated greed masquerading as a domestic tragedy. The question that remained, however, was how he planned to present himself as the rightful heir without revealing the identity he had been forced to abandon. The initial investigation centered on the matriarch Eleanor Lamb. The authorities found the kitchen knife discarded near her prone form, and the narrative of a desperate, final act of a broken woman seemed to fit the jagged pieces of the scene. It was a convenient conclusion, one that allowed the investigators to close the file and look away from the deeper rot within the mansion walls. Yet, the forensic reality shattered that theory before the ink on the report could even dry. A detailed analysis of the kitchen knife revealed a lack of the necessary force to cause the trauma observed on the victims. The blade was clean, save for a superficial smear of oil, and the handle showed no signs of the friction consistent with a struggle. It was a prop, staged to provide an immediate answer to a complex, cold-blooded execution. The true killer had possessed the physical strength and the clinical detachment required to neutralize 3 people in near-total silence. My focus shifted back to the shadows that had occupied the crawl spaces of the estate. If Eleanor was incapable of the violence, then the perpetrator remained an active, breathing ghost within the house. I returned to the kitchen, examining the knife once more under the harsh glare of a portable lamp. It was then that I noticed the faint, serrated mark on the wooden cutting board. A mark that did not match the blade lying on the floor, but rather a specialized tool used to pry open the heavy, reinforced floorboards in the library. The killer had not just staged a suicide. He had been busy dismantling the house itself. The serrated marks on the floorboard were not merely accidental damage. They were a signature of a deliberate, long-term excavation. I pushed aside the heavy oak desk in the library, revealing a compartment that had been sealed with industrial-grade wax. Inside, there were no stolen jewels or illicit cash. Instead, I found a stack of weathered envelopes, each addressed to a man named Arthur Vane, a name that appeared nowhere in the Lamb family tree. The letters were not correspondence. They were a meticulously curated record of the family's slow psychological unraveling. Every entry detailed the specific triggers used to isolate Henry Lamb from his peers, and to ensure the children remained entirely dependent on his erratic whims. The handwriting shifted slightly over the decades, yet the ink composition remained consistent, suggesting a single, patient author. As I read, a chilling realization took hold. Arthur Vane was not a stranger. He was the caretaker, the man who had walked these halls for 20 years, the silent witness who had allegedly arrived long after the tragedy. The letters revealed that he had been an erased 4th child, a survivor of an earlier, darker chapter of the Lamb family's history. He had returned not to protect the estate, but to reclaim a debt he believed was owed in blood and property. The final letter, dated only 3 days before the massacre, contained a handwritten floor plan of the mansion with specific routes marked in red ink. The caretaker had not just lived within these walls. He had mapped every exit and every vulnerability, waiting for the precise moment when the inheritance could finally be his. The timeline of that final night did not align with the narrative of a spontaneous tragedy. Instead, the evidence pointed to a sequence of calculated movements, synchronized to ensure total silence. The caretaker had not acted in a frenzy. He had moved through the mansion's service corridors with the familiarity of someone who had designed the very architecture he navigated. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the primary circuit breaker for the West Wing was manually tripped, plunging the family quarters into darkness. This was the catalyst. It forced the residents out of their rooms and into the central hallway, exactly where the caretaker waited with the kitchen knife he had retrieved hours earlier. The struggle was brief, not because it lacked violence, but because it was surgical. He neutralized Henry first, ensuring the Patriarch could not exert his usual psychological influence over the children. The second and third acts were committed with chilling efficiency, executed before the household could register the change in atmosphere. There was no suicide note, no frantic call for help, and no sign of a struggle that might have alerted the neighbors. The caretaker had cleaned the blade, wiped the primary surfaces of fingerprints, and returned to his quarters before the clock struck 4 a.m. He had effectively erased the Lamb family from their own legacy, leaving behind a scene that looked like a tragic collapse but functioned as a professional liquidation. The most haunting aspect remained the state of the master bedroom, where the heavy curtains were drawn tight, sealing the room against the moonlight. Something inside that room had been moved after the deaths, suggesting the caretaker had returned once more to search for a document he thought he had already secured. The final piece of the puzzle lay tucked into the back of a hollowed-out desk drawer in the study, a place the police had dismissed as empty during their initial sweep. It was an unsent letter, dated 3 days before the massacre, addressed to a solicitor who had long since retired. The ink was faded, yet the intent was razor-sharp. As I read the words in the dim glow of my desk lamp, the narrative of a spontaneous tragedy dissolved entirely. This was not a story of a family imploding under the weight of their own secrets. It was a blueprint for a total systematic erasure. The caretaker had not been a bystander or a simple opportunist. He was the architect of a vendetta that had spanned decades, waiting patiently for the estate to settle so he could claim the remnants. Libby Jones was never intended to be an inheritor. She was the final loose end, a target marked for liquidation the moment she stepped onto the property. Every movement the caretaker made, every circuit breaker pulled, every door locked from the inside, was a calculated step in a long gestating execution. The horror was not in the chaos but in the precision. He had been watching from the shadows of the service corridors, tracking the family like prey, waiting for the perfect confluence of midnight and silence. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The killer had never left the mansion after the massacre. He had simply changed his mask, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the legal finality of the inheritance to complete his dark design. The basement was a tomb of forgotten intentions, smelling of damp concrete and the metallic tang of old wiring. As the beam of my torch swept the perimeter, it illuminated the final damning piece of the puzzle, a modified circuit board wired directly into the mansion's primary alarm system. This was the architect's true masterwork. The caretaker had not merely watched the lambs. He had engineered their isolation, cutting them off from the outside world with the flick of a switch while he moved through the service corridors like a ghost in the machine. I found his ledger tucked behind the primary electrical conduit, a meticulous record of every family secret he had weaponized over the last 20 years. The entries were chilling in their clinical detachment. He had manipulated Henry into paranoia, fed the children's insecurities until they were hollow shells, and finally, orchestrated the massacre to ensure no legal heir remained to contest his claim. The discarded kitchen knife, found weeks later in the crawlspace, bore his unique serrated mark, a signature he had foolishly kept as a trophy of his final act. He had assumed that the chaos of the night would mask his presence, that the police would see only a family destroyed by their own madness. He failed to account for the permanence of physical evidence. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the stagnant midnight air, the weight of the truth finally settled. The mansion was no longer a monument to a dynasty, but a cage that had finally trapped its jailer. The legal system would soon dismantle his fabricated identity, stripping away the mask of the humble servant to reveal the cold, calculating predator beneath. The cycle of the Lamb family's destruction was over, but the silence that remained in the basement felt heavier than ever. The arrest of the caretaker did not bring back the lives lost, but it stripped away the suffocating shroud of the Lamb family's manufactured insanity. As the police tape fluttered in the damp wind of a final lingering night, the mansion stood silent, a hollow shell of a legacy built on deceit. The evidence found in the basement, the ledger, the modified circuits, and the serrated knife, painted a portrait of a man who viewed human lives as mere variables in a grand inheritance equation. He had played the long game, believing he could rewrite history by erasing the family name and claiming the spoils. He failed because he underestimated the weight of the truth. The legal system eventually dismantled his false identity, piece by piece, exposing him not as a servant, but as a parasite who had fed on the lambs for decades. Looking back, the tragedy was never about madness. It was about the cold, calculated erasure of a bloodline for the sake of property and power. Libby Jones walked away from the ruins of her ancestral home with the heavy realization that her own existence had been the final unintended loose end. The mansion now stands empty, a silent testament to the secrets that once thrived within its walls. The case is closed, yet the shadows of what transpired in those rooms remain etched in the local history. Thank you for walking through this dark chapter with me. If you enjoy deep dives into the shadows of true crime, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.